How was the discussion at the tables? What were the common, I'm curious, what were the common difficult conversations that people brought up? Just shout some of them out. Yes? Around money? Yeah, great. Feedback to an employee, great. Firing a client, great. Yeah, which was all of those. Exactly. Well, great. What's terrific about that is that's what we're going to cover today. That's one of the reasons why Andrea and I wrote this book. And who we are, a little bit about us. Thank you, Essie, for setting us up so beautifully. So this is our team. This is our gang that worked together to bring services mainly to our target client is really corporations, mid-size all the way to about $2 billion in size is sort of our focus. And we do a lot of the things that we've already talked about, whether that's leadership development, team development, or executive coaching. And certainly much more about how do you change cultures. So we spend a lot of time in organizations over time. We don't go in for one training program. We tend to stay there for a couple of years. So just to sort of talk a little bit about us. We have 3 objectives for today. Mainly, number 1, we want to talk to you about what are the most common, prevalent, tough conversations. That's why we had you use that question today at your tables. And almost all of the ones that you brought up, actually all of the ones you brought up today, we are going to cover in our presentation. The second thing we want to talk about is tips for disarming those. And then finally, share a presentation or a framework or really a takeaway sheet that you can use when you start to think about having to have some of these conversations, because we all do.
So is anybody familiar with Susan Scott? She wrote several books, but one of them is called Fierce Conversations. This is her quote. "The person who can most accurately describe reality without laying blame will emerge the leader." We deal a lot in organizations with blame and finger pointing, so we'd like to start here with, okay, can we start with not laying blame first? So why do we write the book? We wrote it last year, and it was really prompted by our experiences, ours and the folks who work with us. Repetitive themes kept coming up. People who were not having difficult conversations, they were avoiding them. So we'll go through a couple of the key topics in a little bit.
And several of the topics that these guys already mentioned
absolutely
were the key topics. So.
Yeah, they are. And there's something about gaining confidence and having the confidence to tackle a tough conversation. It definitely impacts women. This is something that we've seen in research, and we've seen it in reality in terms of our interaction with groups. So women who are most confident in addressing high-stakes conversations are more likely to enjoy promotions, higher pay, and better reputation. So how do you gain that confidence?
So what do you think is a difficult conversation? How would you describe it? Just curious. Confrontational. Yeah. How else might you describe it? Emotional. Yep. Something you're afraid to say. Yeah. Well, for Andrea and I, we've kind of boiled it down to anything you have a hard time talking about. It's going to feel hard. Something's going to happen. It could be emotional. It could be confrontational. It could be any of those things that you've mentioned. And so how many of you right now in this room need to have one? We're curious. You're putting one off, or you need to have one. You don't feel like you've had the skill, or it hasn't been the right time. Raise your hands high so we can see them. So it looks like it's about, I don't know, 40%? Mm-hmm. Yeah, roughly. That makes sense. So when we looked out and did some research, well, actually, this is research from Vital Smarts. I don't know if you've heard of their organization. They wrote Crucial Conversations and some of those types of books. And they find that at any given time, 70% of us usually need to have one. Our research we conducted with over 100 folks actually talked about there being 82%. So,
and it was different categories too. We broke ours out. Who do you need to have a conversation with? So the peers of the folks we needed to have the conversation with, peers was the least. Direct reports was next, but the boss and the manager was the highest in terms of people who were coming to our website saying that they needed to have a difficult conversation. Now this is interesting statistic. So in another survey, it was asking managers, how skilled are you in having a critical conversation? And the good news is that at least 1/3 of them, 2/3 of them were self-aware enough to say that I'm not skilled. Only 1/3 said that they were. When you ask the director employees, the direct folks, yeah, only 21% of them thought that their managers were really great at tackling a tough conversation.
So we're not good at it, and there's another thing that sometimes can matter, and that is the context. What company do you work in? What culture do you thrive in? What are the clients or the vendors that you tend to spend time with? How combative is that environment at the organizational, the department, or even the team level? Sometimes the culture is a great place, but it may be the climate that you as the boss are setting or that the boss you work for is setting. And so the team may feel combative even though the organization is not that way. So we love this quote by George Bernard Shaw, which is, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has actually taken place. Isn't that funny? I had that tough talk with my husband. I just didn't actually share it with him. So we see this happen time and time again, and Andrea already mentioned this. You've heard silos, right? I'm in the sales department, therefore I'm much more important than that marketing department, than that operations department, than that finance department. How dare they come and ask me X, Y, or Z, right? And so a place of judgment takes place for a lot of us, sometimes especially when we're angry or these difficult conversations are about to take place. And disputes can even escalate from that territorial feeling or from that lack of accountability. We'll talk in a few moments about peers and what happens when we have to have a conversation. Sometimes it's even easier to tell somebody that works for us, I have a problem with you and you need to get in line on X, Y, or Z. But now to have to go talk to a peer, that I don't actually have true influence, or they don't report to me, or I haven't hired them, it's just a peer that may have let me down. So we'll talk some about accountability among peers also. And then hidden agendas. Don't you love when someone sort of asks you all those leading questions and you're like not sure where this conversation is going? That for me is a huge trigger. I get triggered and I go right from 0 to 60 when I fear the hidden agenda is something that the person is trying to pull a fast one on me, and I become even more skeptical about their motives.
And it usually starts with, Becky, don't you think it would be a really good idea if you?
Yeah. It's all about me changing? What about you? Yeah.
So we know that 99% of folks, when they're interviewed, say, yes, I would love to have a candid work environment, and I'm willing to work toward that. But when you ask them, does it really exist in your environment? No, it does not. And again, that's what we were pulled in a lot to work on with clients, is the culture. Creating cultures of engagement would start with behaviors of trust. So how do we build that? Now, another show of hands. We're really curious. How many of you actually work either remotely, you're separated from your teams, or you work with vendors, et cetera, or clients that you don't see on a regular basis? So raise a hand. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, quite a few.
Yeah, almost 70%.
Yeah, that poses, as you can well imagine, some major challenges in its own right for having a challenging conversation, because you don't have the visual cues, which most of us work off of in terms of, did that land, the comment that I just made? Or you can tell when somebody's saying something, but their body language suggests that they didn't really mean what they just said. There you go. So one of the things we want to be aware of when we're getting ready to have a challenging conversation is knowing which audience we're having it with. And we briefly touched upon this in the survey a minute ago. And we have to grapple with all of them. Are we talking about a client, a manager, a senior leader? Are we talking about peers and colleagues? And that, we do a lot of 360 work, if you know what that is, where one individual gets evaluated in 360 feedback from others. The people who give the harshest feedback are hands down peers. It happens in every organization, everything that we've ever evaluated. And then down, my direct reports and staff. So just keeping that in mind, who our audiences are as we go forward.
Where women have the most difficulty, and you've mentioned some of these already, whether that be negotiating, right? We have a hard time sometimes talking about money. Performance reviews, especially if it's a friend or somebody we care about or we've become empathetic towards something that may be happening. We were working with a client last week and he was having trouble with somebody that was coming in late. And this had been a star performer for him for a number of years. And suddenly the person had begun this sort of bad habit of arriving late. And because they had a strong showing on the team, he didn't really know how to approach him. And then, lo and behold, he calls the guy in to talk to him, and he says, listen, I am having a hard time, and I'll tell you why. We've got a new baby now, and, the baby is 10 months old, and, we can't find great daycare. And so he goes on and on and on with this story. And, the guy says, I knew I was hooked. I started immediately, I couldn't even have the real conversation anymore because I've got a 10-month-old baby. So it's like, that empathy sometimes can play with us. So sometimes that's where women have the most trouble. And then dealing with politics, the ickiness of that, or competition, or managing friendships. And I think finally then, how do we give that performance review or give the vendor the boot that we may need to give the vendor the boot when we care about them or when there's been some kind of a connection established. And I think for women that's genuinely hard for us because we do like to, that's how we initially connect. We connect by establishing a relationship. So what percentage of us are confident that we actually have the ability to handle these difficult conversations? Well, research tells us 87% of us are not that confident in dealing with this. We either get hijacked, we get emotionally, emotive about the whole thing, or we may shut down and just not have the tools for dealing with it. So we're curious right now, who is it that you have the greatest challenge when having these conversations? Is it, and make these your own. If you are in a corporate environment and some of this applies, make it your own. We've tried to add some things like vendors and clients and other things, but make this work for you. But who is it that you struggle the most when it comes to having these kinds of conversations?
And we'll just take a couple of minutes.
Just a couple of minutes. Just turn to your neighbor. Yeah.
It's like a rejection. I wouldn't want that to happen to me. So.
Come on back. Clients and vendors. Okay.
So we picked 9 topics in the book that we created with the help of Vanessa Lowry, was our support. Yes. When we pulled this together. We're going to walk you through 3 of these just in the next few minutes and have a little bit of a deeper dive so that you can prepare for the conversation that you know that you need to have going forward. So the 3 that we're going to explore a little bit are performance reviews, negotiation, because that could be at all those audiences, right? It could be negotiating with your peers, it could be negotiating with vendors, customers, your manager, et cetera. And then peer-to-peer accountability, which again we run into a lot in terms of a challenge. Here is a stat that we absolutely love. 8 out of 10 men feel the need to be careful and indirect in providing feedback to women. Flip that, 8 out of 10 women want direct feedback.
Yep. So keeping with performance, sometimes the difficulty in a performance review setting is also how do I give the tough news, but along with that is what do I get out of it? So it can be difficult on both ends. It can be difficult for those that have to give some bad news. It can be difficult for those that receive a performance review that it's like, wow, nothing really just got said. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. As a matter of fact, this is an old pattern. I've been hearing this on my performance review for the last 3 years. Can't they find something new to talk to me about? Or what's really happening here? So deja vu, if any of you have that happen to you, it's very common. And then in addition to that, if the real goal of having a difficult conversation around a performance review is for both ends to leave with some kind of action that allows for next year's performance review to be a different conversation, consider that less than 13% of people actually leave with some kind of plan, some kind of here's your 3 goals, or even the person stepping up and saying here's the 3 goals I'll do based on this performance review. So there's lots that can be done to improve the performance review process, and it's not always about the tough conversation, it's how does it land and now what?
And even though in performance, when we talk performance review, most of us go straight to here's corporate and a direct report. It could apply to the performance of a vendor, right? Or if you flip it, the performance of a client who was supposed to bring you some information. Because they didn't, you can't get your job done either. So it really does apply in multiple situations.
So
our tip.
And we have several of these in the book. But basically, be prepared. come in to present a 90-day plan. We worked with an executive years ago who actually, after I left Macy's, we worked with a gentleman that was having trouble with that pattern. You know, every year he tended to hear the same thing. He was a passionate guy, and he was sort of out there with his opinions, and he could be emotional. And he was trying to tone that down because he really did drive good things, and his performance was solid every year, but he wasn't getting to the next level. He decided to break his performance review, even though they only reviewed him annually, into 90-day plans. And he would go in and sit with his boss and say, here's the goals I've got for the 90 days. Do you align and sign up with these? And if you do, let's discuss them at the end of those 90 days. He's now a VP with the company, and it totally changed. He still does that now, some 9 years later, where he breaks his performance review down into 4 quarterly conversations so that there's not, at the end of the year, a difficult conversation. And he's also leading how those conversations flow. So it's an idea if you're in the corporate setting. And I think you can do some of the same things if you're not. If you're running your own business, how often do you do a quarterly review with those vendors or those clients? You know, have you ever fired a client because the difficult conversations aren't being had? And what would happen to your time, your energy, and your emotional, you know, reserves if you did do that? So I think it's a nice tip just overall.
So when we go into the conversation about negotiation, gender does matter according to the research, and this is based on a variety of research that we've pulled from Stanford and Harvard over the years. We are excellent when it comes to, and I'll broadly state this, we are excellent when it comes to negotiating for someone else. We are, for whatever reason, we are just not great at negotiating for ourselves when we walk into the same conversation. So something just to be aware of as we start this down that path. And then in terms of the tough topics around negotiation, it does have to do with negotiating limits. And we can say that that would be limits around a variety of things that we've run into. Limits around boundaries of work, limits around boundaries of time, limits around the role. So it's not just a money thing. It does have to do with how you engage with your work and the respect for who you are and how you need to establish boundaries going forward. But specifically, negotiating salary increases, sort of the, we delay, and we don't prepare as well as we possibly could.
And I think that that's a good one around sort of understanding what you may want to negotiate around and that it's not always money. We have a client that we adore, but they tend to work late. So, you know, the emails or the requests are coming in at 11, 12, 1 in the morning. Well, you know, I still have teenagers and, you know, Andrea and I both, we prioritize getting our sleep. We like to get into the office early. So for us, 10 o'clock, you know, we're in bed. So, you know, you hear the iPhone going off by your bed. You have to reset those boundaries, and how do you do that respectfully? You know, I'll respond to all of your correspondence after 8 a.m. the next day, but somehow, and you know, and the first time you answer it, right, or you get up and think, well, it's my #1 client, so I'll go and, you know, you're sort of setting yourself up for a repeatable pattern, or then how do you break that later? So understanding what boundaries serve us and don't serve us, I think is part of it.
It is, and there's a price to pay for this, the cost of it. We can leave anywhere from $1 million up to $1.5 million on the table because at the very beginning of our careers we didn't negotiate very well, but also we didn't course correct as we went forward. So there's a price.
And speaking of that price, when I worked at Macy's, I was I worked for them for 25 years. I was about 15 years into my career, and I had just been promoted at the same time that a couple of other gentlemen had been promoted. And we all had about $100 million in scope of businesses that we each ran. So it was a $300 million business that we reported into one boss, one male boss. And I can remember that the way they used to do the old United Way cards, I don't know if anybody else had this experience, was they would hand out your United Way card, and at the top of the United Way card in the corner, they had 10% of your salary because they wanted you to give 10% that year. So this is a good one. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist when you're sort of looking. I'm sitting by Don and I'm sitting by Steve, and I'm recognizing, gee, my number's the smallest. So I can remember that night, my boss was very athletic, and we both enjoyed training for marathons and stuff, so we were out training that night on the beach, and I was so livid. I mean, talk about wanting to have a difficult conversation. And I came by the information, honestly. It's not like I, pulled one of them aside and say, hey, I get the feeling you're making more than me. Can you shed some light on what your salary is? But I can remember when I was finally calm enough to have the discussion, I was really glad I did. That was after I ran him into the ground that night when we were training. And I can remember him saying, "Wow, you're really fast tonight." But I did tackle it. I was so livid, And eventually it did happen. But when I think about if I hadn't had the courage, and luckily, if the United Way had, to this day, I love that United Way, hadn't come around to supply that opportunity, I don't know how I ever would have found it out. And so, they had young children, and I was single, and that was one of the first lines my boss tried to use on me. Well, they have kids. Yes. And one day I will too. I do now have 2 kids, so I need to provide for them. So anyway, just a story to keep in mind. It still happens.
So therein lies our tip.
Yeah.
Know what you're worth.
Yeah. The soccer team. Anybody seen the stats on the soccer team? The women made $14,000. The men make $300,000 plus a year. Same U.S. soccer team. Makes you wonder.
So why do we avoid difficult conversations? And just find yourself up on this slide in any way, shape, or form that suits you. It's either fear because we've had one before and we got slammed and we don't want that to happen again, or fear for other reasons. Because we walk into it with a mindset potentially of win and lose, that I'm going to have this conversation, but when we walk out the door, either I'm going to win or I'm going to lose. And that is one thing that we end up coaching around a lot. It's, wait a minute, where's the win-win for both parties involved? And actually, that's a shift in mindset is what we've discovered. And lack of skill, which is really what we want to point to today. It's building awareness, but also building a couple of skills that can help you build that confidence we talked about earlier. And we will end up the conversation in about 15 or 20 minutes around preparing for it. So what will help you, and this came up in our conversation over lunch with a discussion about what's one thing that really does help you with difficult conversations. It's preparing for it. I think I know where I want to head with the conversation. I know who I'm going to be dealing with. I know my biases that I bring into the conversation. So I'm prepared. And I'm prepared to be open that there may be another way that we can solve this issue that the other person may suggest to us. So her comment for the benefit of the audio recording was, how can we tackle our own derailers? In your case, it's going to be high emotion, which has a physical impact. For me, it's a physical impact, but it also shuts my brain down. I can't think. I can't connect sentence 1 with sentence 2 when I'm that upset. Becky's solution is to go run like hell.
Yeah.
That's what she does. But to your point, it starts with awareness, knowing that is going to be the critical fork in the road for you. So if we know that that's our tendency, what can you do for yourself? And this is the rhetorical question. What can you do for yourself to help yourself emotionally get grounded? And everybody does something slightly differently. I've got one client who writes out feelings and emotions so that she feels at least that she's acknowledged them, and then she can put it aside. She doesn't even have to speak it out. I've got another client who's got a really good friend at work, and she actually ends up talking one-on-one with that individual before she walks in the door. And it's part of it is just being prepared to know that you're an emotional person. And as you'll see on our preparation sheet, feelings are facts. That's a fact that you're going to be bringing into the course of the conversation. And part of it may be hard for us to admit, hey, Becky, let's have this conversation about, this challenging decision we need to make, and I just need to put on the table that right now my emotion that I'm feeling around this is a bit frustration. Yeah. So naming it can also help, and then it prepares the other person to recognize you where you are.
Yeah. And sometimes that can be what you say. I don't feel safe right now with the way I'm going to react, so I am going to go meditate, take a walk, call a friend, do whatever. Can we have this conversation in 2 hours? And then getting mentally prepared. But we'll talk more about that. But great question. The old punch a pillow, punch a wall, whatever it takes. And then lastly, we're now moving towards that peer-to-peer piece, which I know you'll be interested in, which is accountability. And for many of us, Teams was the greatest invention in the 70s and 80s when we started thinking about how do we make work more collaborative, how do we get more out of people, how do we move away from sort of the line mentality where everybody's in a row, start to produce and harness the power of teams. Well, along the way, right, we came up with this model that there's one leader and then there's, whatever number of folks that report in. But a lot of times the work that actually gets done on teams gets done between the peers. The boss can't be in every situation and in every interaction. And it's that peer-to-peer accountability. If somebody tells you they're going to have something to you by 3 o'clock and they don't. And as that happens over time and trust gets eroded, we may begin to believe, right, I do all the work on this team. What the heck is she doing? And so we don't want to speak up. And look at this. So when I feel somebody else, a big project has to be produced by September 1. And now it's time to produce the project, and there were 4 of us working on it. And I felt one of the players didn't do their job on it, yet I never spoke up. I either went to the other 2 or 3 and figured out the end around, or I did more work myself, took it on because I did. So that can happen to each of us. We don't know how to then say to the peer, you've let the team down, or you've let us down, or you've let me down. And can we get back to sort of both, working towards the same goals here? But that's really hard. Those numbers are staggering. Only 10% of the people will even say anything. That's frightening.
It is frightening. So are you all familiar with Patrick Lencioni and his work? Yeah, he wrote a great book, I think in the early 2000s, called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it's now been converted. The version of it that we do is 5 Behaviors of a Cohesive Team, which we like a whole lot better. It's the same model, but it's just a more positive spin to it. But the interesting things, so in this model, teams self-evaluate. And over time, they've been tracking the self-evaluation of each team in terms of the areas that the team feels that they excel at or they need that they need development in. So of the 5 areas, developing trust, being able to artfully tackle conflict, achieving commitment at all levels. The 4th one is accountability, peer-to-peer accountability. And the 5th one is direct results, achieving results. Bless you. Hands down, the numbers that come in the lowest are around peer-to-peer accountability over and over and over again. So it says, hey guys, this is a skill we need to develop, but we really need to better understand. So in terms of accountability, so our tip around accountability here is if you can say it out loud. Part of our conversation today is about getting courageous and having them, knowing what you card in as an individual, but also about having the courage to just start the conversation, build the habit, do it more and more often, you get much more confident about it. Go first, clarify the roles and the expectations and the time frames in terms of your agreements with your peers, etc. We find that a lot is a lack of communication and lack of clarity and lack of just articulating what the expectation is. A lot of assumptions get made and just never articulated. And then make a public commitment, again, sharing it verbally with everyone on the team. And then identify for yourself, what do you think you're tolerating? Because if we don't acknowledge what we're tolerating, we go back to that 90-10 slide that Becky just walked us through. Right? And then we feel even more frustrated when we're getting ready to go and have a conversation. That's a great setup. So the question is, I don't want to be perceived of as a tattletale. If I'm working with Patrice and Patrice has not shown up at the meetings on time and she's not delivered her commitments over a period of time, am I going to run to my boss, Becky, and complain about it or just escalate it? So Patrice's question is, wait a minute, would the better response be for me to go to Patrice? The answer is yes.
Yes.
That is the place that you really want to start because you're developing the relationship with your peers so that I can count on you, so that you understand what my expectations are. If we need to, then we go to Becky and say, hey, we need you to come in and have a coaching session with the 2 of us about this.
As a matter of fact, we see far too many people try that method of we call it almost triangulation. Mm-hmm. They send the secret email, you didn't see this from me, but, so-and-so once again screwed it up, And, sort of like, what does the boss do with that? I mean, if you really think about it, you've put the boss in an incredibly difficult place, right, where they can't really do anything with it. So what we try to urge leaders to do is go back when they come to you, and not so much that they're tattling, but I can see that you're in pain about this situation. Go have the conversation with Patrice. You owe it to her. You owe our team that. And if that can start to happen, then I think that you'll see more of that accountability. And then the boss doesn't have to play policeman. They can instead be worrying strategically about where should we go next and how do we get more revenue or whatever.
So we're nearing the end here. We're going to give you some time to work with each other in just a minute. We would like to just say that our final tip truly is all about preparing. That really is the answer to this, and there are various ways that you can go about it, but the key question is, who are you getting ready to have the conversation with? What's the current situation and the context, all the facts and the figures, so that, and that actually helps to disarm some of the emotion typically that we bring into the conversation as well. The third one is, what direction do I really want the conversation to take? I do have something that I would like to get out of this conversation. It's my agenda, by the way. But what's the direction I would really like for that to take? And we find that that makes it a heck of a lot less difficult to have.
So what are the feminine traits? So what do we do really well when you think about us sitting down to have conversations or just conversing in general? You know, we mentioned earlier that women like to connect, and I think there's several things that we do really well. We listen very effectively. We know research tells us that we are better listeners than men. We're going to show you that in a minute. And that we're diplomatic. We can usually try to find the bridge. You know, let me figure this out. Is there a way that this can actually, is there a silver lining playbook here? We want to find that. We care about the impact. So I think there's something that comes up for us. And we're naturally empathetic in most cases. So those are things to keep in mind. When you think about our traits versus perhaps some of our male counterparts, we are attentive in those conversations, and 72% of us believe that. And we believe that men are not as attentive. And by the way, what's good is the men agree with us. So we love that. So we're attentive. We're willing to listen. We're willing to sit down and oftentimes have them, which is the good news.
So you've got a handout on your table. If you don't, let us know. I'll give it to you. And we would like to set you up so that you have a sharing time right now. But the audience is where in the organization or who do you need to be having this conversation with. So it could be a vendor, it could be a client, et cetera. But get that person clearly in mind. Some of the questions that we're asking you are they aware that this is a situation? Because it gets a little dicey if they have no clue
Blind spot.
that you're upset about peer-to-peer accountability. Yeah, if it's a blind spot, that's different. What perspective might they be bringing to the conversation? And then fourth question to start to ask yourself is, are you clear about what they value? So if I'm a person who values getting things done well and appropriately, I may have a different sense of time urgency than Becky, who cares about results now. She values speed. So part of this is just getting into a point of acknowledgement that they have a different set of motivators than I might have. That's really the point of that question. And then about yourself, you know, ask yourself the same questions. What's my value? What's prompting me to want to engage in this conversation? What's important to me? What do I know about my tendencies? Thank you very much for the question about emotion, because that's exactly one of the things that you really want to be aware of. The third area is what's the current situation, and we go to facts and figures on this. And again, as we said earlier, feelings can be a fact. You know, how do I feel about it? Is this a pattern? Are you running into situations where you find yourself struggling with difficult conversations with peers on a regular basis or with clients on a regular basis? And is it always around the same kind of topic? Is there a pattern there? And then finally, the fourth section down at the bottom is direction. What's your motivation for this dialogue? Why do you think you need to have it? What might be some mutual goals? This is sort of where we get out of the either or, either they win or I win conversation. What might be some mutual goals that can come out of the conversation that could prompt more of a we working together to resolve this issue? So what we think we'd like for you to do is take just a couple minutes and pair up again. I think we've got enough folks in the room that we can do this and take enough time to share with each other. You know, who the person is that you need to, or the type of person that you need to have the conversation with.
Perhaps no names.
No names. A little bit about yourself, and then what the situation is. So if you just have that conversation, maybe briefly, 2 minutes, and then share each way, and we'll call you back.
Okay, hi, my name is Tricia Mulcare, president of ProWin, a women's networking group here in Atlanta. I just heard Becky and Andrea speak on how to have difficult conversations at work, and I can't wait to use some of these tools both in my work life as I deal with both subordinates and my boss, but also as I deal with others on nonprofit boards and friends of my children in the community. So plenty of great tools that I can use and use right now.
My name is Lanier Quantz. I own a residential cleaning service and therefore have a lot of reviews that I need to do for my employees and difficult, sticky situations that I need to confront. And what I learned today is that I need to become aware of my own stumbling points, how to discuss with someone the issues that I'm having with them without placing blame on them, how to prepare for that conversation, and also about the peer-to-peer. We have teams, and so to help the teammates better communicate with each other versus always running to the boss to say I have a problem with her. I think I can pass that knowledge down and make my entire organization work better.
So as a woman, I was able to use a number of the tools both to acknowledge some of the ways that I behave when I'm under pressure and dealing with a difficult conversation, but also accepting when I'm working with a woman who may have difficult thoughts to express back to me, whether it's someone who's relating to me as her boss or as a teammate. And so to be able to use those tools and have them in my back pocket is going to be very helpful.
Hi, my name is Nichelle Jones, and what I enjoyed about the presentation today is how it concentrated on helping women do better in having or handle those difficult conversations. As women, we have a tendency to want to take on the issue or the problem for our client or our customer or even our subordinate, and this would just help facilitate us to be able to have that conversation to make sure people are clear, they're on point, making sure that we understand their point, but also making sure that we both get to the same goal.